Welcome back, everybody. We're diving deep today into the work of Rabindranath Tagore. Um, he was this incredible figure from India, a poet, novelist, musician. He even won a Nobel Prize.
Oh yeah, a true Renaissance man.
Exactly. But
Yeah.
today we're focusing on his ideas about nationalism.
Very timely, I think.
Yeah, and it's extra interesting because Tagore was actually critical of nationalism, back when India was fighting for independence from the British.
Right,
Right.
right. And to really understand why his critique was such a big deal, you have to remember what India was like back then. Early 20th century, a whole nation in turmoil, just desperate for self-rule, and so many people saw nationalism as the key, the only way to get there. But then you have Tagore, right in the middle of all that, questioning this very idea that was supposed to set everyone free.
So instead of just cheering for India's independence, he's saying, hey, wait, what kind of nation are we trying to build here? It's like he was looking past just getting rid of the British and thinking about what comes next.
Exactly. He was concerned about the long game, the implications.
So where do we even begin to unpack all of that?
Well, Tagore really lays out his main argument in an essay he wrote called Nationalism in India.
Oh, I've heard of that one.
Yeah, and in it he argues that, that nationalism, at least how people usually thought about it, could actually split humanity apart and cause even more conflict.
That's a pretty bold statement for the time.
He was worried about the kind of nationalism that just wants power,
Yeah.
that puts politics and taking over land above basic human values and people's well-being.
It's almost like he was saying, hey, power isn't everything.
Right, and you brought up a really good point earlier about the context. See, Tagore saw this happening in the West. Powerful countries focused on taking over other places and controlling the world's economy.
Right. Colonialism and all that. So you're saying that seeing that play out influenced how he viewed nationalism even back in India?
Absolutely. Tagore was incredibly critical of how Western nations use nationalism to justify colonialism, taking advantage of other people and places. He saw how chasing national glory could come at a huge cost. It led to wars, oppression, and people losing their basic freedoms. And he was worried that India, in its excitement to become its own modern country, might fall into those same traps.
It's like he's drawing a line between a harmful, selfish kind of nationalism and something else, something better.
Yeah.
So did Tagore think there was any way to be patriotic, to love your country without falling into those dangerous patterns?
Yeah, he did. He wasn't against loving your country or your culture. It was more about what he called narrow nationalism.
What's that, narrow nationalism?
I don't know nationalism. It's the kind that makes people blind to what others need, blind to how other people see things. And that leads to intolerance and, yeah, conflict. Tagore believed that real love for your country has to come from a deep respect for all of humanity. He saw a potential for patriotism that was inclusive, compassionate, a kind of patriotism that celebrated differences and actually wanted to work with other nations.
So it's not about just caring about people within your own borders, but expanding that circle outwards. That's a really powerful idea, especially now when we have global problems that need everyone to cooperate.
That's it, exactly. Tagore believed the biggest challenges we face, humanity's challenges, those can only be solved if we work together, not by competing. He thought we needed to move beyond that us versus them way of thinking and embrace a bigger, more interconnected picture of the world.
We've been talking a lot about Tagore's critiques of the nationalism he was seeing, but he didn't just criticize, did he? He had his own vision for something different. He called it universal humanism. It almost sounds, kind of radical.
It was radical, yeah, especially for that time. And it still makes people think today. Tagore believed that just being human should matter more than what country you're from. He imagined a world where people connect across borders, sharing ideas, cultures, you name it, recognizing that, that we're all human beings at the end of the day.
So this universal humanism, was that just an idea for him, or did he have actual examples of how it could work? What did he really picture?
Oh, he had ideas. He thought about education systems that taught people about all sorts of different cultures and perspectives. He wanted to see art and literature crossing borders, thought they could be powerful tools for understanding and empathy. And he spent a lot of time talking to thinkers and activists all over the world, trying to build those bridges of connection and cooperation.
Wow. So he was really trying to live out these ideas, not just write about them. It makes you wonder how people in India reacted to his critique of nationalism, especially since, everyone was really fired up about independence, which seemed tied up with nationalistic feelings.
Right. Yeah, it definitely ruffled some feathers. To
Uh,
speak out against nationalism when everyone else was so gung-ho about it, that caused debate, even some criticism. Some folks saw him as working against the independence movement.
I bet. But I'm guessing others agreed with his concerns about the dangers of nationalism and liked his vision for a world where everyone's included and connected.
Oh, absolutely. It resonated with a lot of people. But here's the thing that's really important to understand about Tagore. He wasn't rejecting being Indian. He wasn't saying we should get rid of national cultures. It was more like he was warning people about the dangers of letting nationalism become too narrow and selfish and ultimately self-defeating. He believed you could be proud of your country in a way that respected all of humanity.
So it's not about picking one or the other, loving your country or loving humanity. It's about finding that balance, that deeper understanding.
Exactly. And that might be one of the biggest things he left behind. Tagore pushed people to think beyond just their national identity and embrace a much bigger, more inclusive view of what it means to be human.
And it's amazing how relevant those ideas still are. In today's world with globalization and everything, it's almost like he was looking ahead and giving us some guidance for navigating a world where, well, where borders are becoming less important in some ways.
He was definitely a visionary, ahead of his time in a lot of ways.
So we've been really digging into Tagore's idea of universal humanism and how it challenged the way people thought about nationalism. But I'm kind of curious, about how his views stacked up against other big figures from that era. Like, what about Mahatma Gandhi? They're both pushing for India's independence, but it seems like they had pretty different ways of going about it.
Yeah, that's a really important thing to think about. I mean, both Tagore and Gandhi, they wanted India free from British rule, obviously. But their philosophies, their strategies, those were different. Gandhi, he really pushed nonviolent resistance, satyagraha, and he saw nationalism as like this powerful tool for bringing people together in that struggle. He thought that having a strong national identity was crucial for getting Indians to rise up against colonial rule.
So, okay, where did Tagore disagree? He wasn't against India being independent, was he?
Not at all, no. He wanted freedom for his country, definitely. But here's the thing. He was suspicious of what he called political nationalism. He thought that this kind of nationalism, the kind that's all about grabbing power and being in charge, could backfire. Like, sure, it might help you achieve political goals, but it also had this tendency uh, to make people turn inwards, become exclusive, and that could even lead to oppression and conflict.
Huh, interesting. So he didn't hate the idea of being proud of your nation or having a national identity, but he was worried about how nationalism could be twisted into something harmful.
Yeah, exactly. His critique was really aimed at what he saw as the downsides of a really narrow, selfish kind of nationalism. He was concerned that kind of thinking could make people ignore the suffering of those outside their own nation. It could lead to a lack of empathy and compassion. And he was also afraid it could create this, like, unhealthy sense of being better than everyone else, which, of course, could lead to more conflict and aggression.
So if he wasn't on board with this limited view of nationalism, what was his alternative? We've touched on his concept of universal humanism, but how did he see that playing out in the real world, especially during India's fight for independence?
Tagore believed that true freedom for India wasn't just about getting the British out. It was deeper than that. He argued that real liberation needed a change in how people thought, a shift away from that limited nationalism towards a much broader, more inclusive way of seeing the world. And he felt that India, with its long history of different cultures and spiritual traditions, could be a model for that. Like, India could show everyone the beauty of unity and diversity.
So he saw this chance for India to, set an example, not just by becoming independent, but by showing a new way of existing in the world, one based on being connected and respecting each other.
Exactly. He imagined an India that celebrated its own unique heritage, but was also open to the beauty and wisdom of other cultures. An India that would be a leader in building bridges between nations, working towards a world where differences are celebrated, not feared. He saw India's fight for independence as part of a much bigger fight, a human fight for freedom from all kinds of oppression and injustice.
It sounds like he was calling for a kind of global solidarity, recognizing that we're all connected no matter what country we're from.
That's a good way to put it. Tagore believed that the toughest problems we face, poverty, war, the environment, all those things can only be solved if we work together. He felt that being stuck in those narrow nationalistic views would just make it harder to deal with these shared challenges.
It's really striking how relevant his ideas feel today.
Mm.
The world's so interconnected, and we have these complicated global problems that need everyone to cooperate if we want to solve them. It's like he predicted a lot of what we're going through now.
He really did have a remarkable foresight. And his ideas give us a really useful framework for thinking about how to handle the complexities of our globalized world. He reminds us that while national identities can be important, they shouldn't make us ignore the needs and perspectives of people in other countries. He encourages us to cultivate this sense of shared humanity, to understand that our destinies are linked, and to recognize that, if we want a good future, we have to work together.
That's a powerful message, especially now when we see this rise in nationalism and global tensions. But if Tagore saw these dangers so clearly, why do you think these narrow nationalist ideas are still so popular? Why do they still have such a hold on people?
Well, that's a tough question. I think part of it has to do with that basic human need to belong, to have an identity. Nationalism can give you a strong sense of belonging to a group. It offers shared history, culture, purpose. And that can be especially bustling when things are uncertain or changing, when people are looking for stability and connection.
So it can be a way of finding meaning in a world that often feels chaotic and overwhelming?
Right. And unfortunately, that need for belonging can be manipulated, especially by those in power. Nationalist feelings can be used to create that us versus them mentality, to scapegoat people who are different, and to justify policies that benefit a few at the expense of everyone else.
We've definitely seen that throughout history, haven't we? Nationalistic fervor being used to divide people and justify
Oh,
terrible things.
yeah, sadly we have. And it's something we need to be very aware of, especially today. With social media and all that, it's so easy to spread misinformation and divisive rhetoric. It's like throwing gasoline on a fire.
So how do we fight that? How do we develop that more balanced, enlightened understanding of what it means to be a citizen of a nation and a citizen of the world, like Tagore talked about?
I think education is a huge part of it.
Yeah.
We need to teach young people about how complicated history is, about how interconnected our world is, and about the importance of understanding and empathy across cultures. We need to help them develop critical thinking skills so they can tell the difference between truth and lies and recognize when someone's trying to manipulate them. And we need to create spaces where people from different backgrounds can come together, connect, and build relationships based on shared values and respect.
That sounds like a difficult task, but a really important one if we want to create a more just and peaceful world.
It is difficult, but I think Tagore's life and work give us reason to be hopeful. He showed us that it's possible to love your own culture and embrace the diversity of humanity at the same time. He showed us that you don't have to demonize others to be patriotic.
His vision reminds us that we have more in common than what divides us, that ultimately we should let our shared humanity guide our actions.
Exactly, and that's a message that couldn't be more relevant today.
So we've been talking all about Tagore's critique of nationalism, his hope for a more connected world, all that. But if Tagore could somehow see the world today, what do you think he'd focus on? What would stand out to him?
Ooh, that's a good one. On the one hand, I think he'd be blown away by how interconnected we are. His vision of this global society where ideas and cultures are constantly moving and mixing. That's become real in a lot of ways because of technology. But then again, I bet he'd be worried too, because a lot of the problems he talked about 100 years ago, they're still around. Conflict, inequality, these narrow nationalistic ideas popping up again.
It's like we're living in a world where his dreams and his warnings are both coming true at the same time. We've got this incredible ability to connect and collaborate, but we're also still pulled towards division and fear. It's complicated. What can we learn from Tagore, from his life and work, to help us deal with all this?
Well, Tagore wasn't about giving people a strict set of rules to follow, more like a roadmap. He was all about independent thought, critical thinking. He wanted us to question everything, even the stuff that seems super obvious in our culture. And he'd probably say, we need to do the same thing today, really examine the narratives we're being fed and try to find different perspectives.
So, not just accepting the easy answers or the loudest voices, we've got to dig deeper, think for ourselves, especially with so much information flying around these days. It's so easy to just get caught up in whatever's trending.
Right. And Tagore really believed in education. He saw it as this key to opening our minds, challenging those old ideas we have stuck in our heads. Education helps us build empathy, understand different cultures, all that. And that's so important in a world where, well, we're all connected whether we like it or not.
We talked a lot about Tagore's critique of nationalism and his vision for a world where everyone's connected. But what do you think is the most important thing he left behind? What's the one takeaway you hope listeners will hold on to?
Tagore's legacy is, well, it's big. But if I had to pick just one thing, the core of it all, it's this. Our shared humanity, that's what matters most. It goes beyond any boundaries. Geography, culture, politics, none of that matters as much as that basic connection we all have as human beings.
We're all part of the same human family, sharing this planet, dealing with the same problems, even though we have our differences.
Exactly. And I think that's a message we need now, maybe more than ever. Tagore's work is a call to action. It's asking us to embrace that interconnectedness, to look at the world with empathy and compassion, to work towards a future where cooperation and understanding win out over conflict and division.
Tagore didn't just tell us what's wrong with the world, he showed us what could be. He imagined a world where, and I love this quote, the mind is without fear and the head is held high.
That's beautiful and something worth fighting for.
Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of Rabindranath Tagore. We hope his ideas sparked something in you, made you think in new ways.
It's been great exploring his work with you.
And remember, the world Tagore imagined, it's not just going to magically appear. We have to build it together. And as he said, you can't cross the sea just by standing and staring at the water. So let's take that first step. Let's embrace our shared humanity and start building that world, one connection at a time.